I'm going through a process right now where I'm rethinking this metric. I'm trying to see how long it takes somebody to normalize and certain variations of certain metrics whenever they're doing the single leg counter movement jump for the first time. So I probably would have felt more confident if I had more than one time point of baseline data for this kid in the single leg counter movement jump, but I don't, and I didn't. So that's one of the things that I think I would have changed looking back.
Hannah Marchant, welcome to VALDCAST.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you having me on today.
Of course. No, we're very excited to have you on. I think this will have a different kind of a flair to some of the other episodes we've had in the past, just because it'll be very, case oriented, and we'll have something like tangible to talk about and the ups and downs and things like that that always happen with clinical practice. So I'm really excited because it'll just be a new format. But without getting too far ahead of myself, for anybody listening who may have not heard of you just yet, could you give a brief background on who you are, what position you're in, kind of maybe a little bit of the story that took you to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thank you so much for this opportunity today. Really looking forward to the chance to chat with you and talk shop. So, started out a college soccer player on like the classic story. I tore my ACL my senior year. And really early on, I saw the difference between evidence-based care as my rehab was just a lot different from some of the other teammates that were going through the same thing. And from that experience, I decided to seek out physical therapy schools that kind of valued data-informed and evidence-based care. Then I ended up at the University of Pittsburgh. And I had some really unbelievable mentors there. Felix Prossel, Stephanie Mock Grubbs, some names. And they really continued to shape my passion for that data-informed care, again, really early on. And then when I was in school there, I worked in some strength and conditioning roles at the semi-professional and collegiate levels just to keep learning how to load people appropriately. And then after I graduated from Pitt, I did sports residency at the Cleveland Clinic. I was there for the past 18 months. And now I'm with New York City Football Club, working alongside some incredible mentors and with more tools than I've ever had before. So it's really been a great journey of growth so far, and I'm excited to see what's ahead for me.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like it's not every day that obviously you kind of go from, two very high quality facilities right out of school. I think a lot of times there's newer grads that come out and they almost have to earn their stripes by, figuring out how to test on a crane scale or how to test on something that's, like within their budget as a student. I remember when I was in PT school, I went out and bought a $30 crane scale just because I was like, I knew this is valuable, but I just didn't have, I was still working on student loans at the time, and so what has it been like just sort of going immediately out of school to have access to a little bit more of the higher technology and I guess more advanced processes that you're now available or that are now available to you?
Yeah, I think I'm the product of some really incredible mentors that have come before me and have shaped who I am really even early on in the practice that I'm in. So I would say I grinded a lot in physical therapy school, and I tried to seek out people that would kind of push the envelope of my practice from the beginning and try to challenge the ways that I thought. And that led me into a couple different directions. So you mentioned high level tech that I have experience with now. I got to see that when I was at Pitt with Stephanie and Felix, and I got to see the processes at a really, really high level. And then I went into some clinic settings, then some strength and conditioning settings where we did not have access to those things, but I still thought it was valuable to track the athletes that I was treating and training. And so I had to become creative. And I was lucky enough to be a part of a project when I was a student at Pitt that just got published on the crane scale that you talked about the reliability and validity. So I had to be creative with some of those low tech options and really learn how to test well when I didn't have access to such resources. So I think it was the combination of having access to high level resources, high level mentors, then also having to be creative with some of the low tech options that brought me to where I am today.
Yeah, I think that's great. You have to a certain degree earn your stripes, with some of the areas before things get a little bit easier. But um I wanna kind of focus in on the main topic at hand today, which obviously I'll let you kind of give the background with, but I guess just tell us about what case we're gonna be talking about, who the athlete was, and just kind of a basic, overview of, what a clinician would want to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So When I was in residency at the Cleveland Clinic, I had the chance to work with a very high-level American high school football team. And then I had the chance to meet this athlete that I'm gonna talk about who is now playing American football at the Division I level. So I had the chance to work with him during his senior season. But before I met him, his freshman year, he had an Oates procedure done on his patella for a cartilage defect that he was struggling with. It's unclear if he had dislocated back then. We were working with a different health system, so we didn't have a lot of background information, so we only knew what was presented to us. Come his senior year, September, he had a traumatic patellar dislocation, but he decided that he wanted to continue playing through the season. They were chasing their third straight state championship. It was a dream team. So we rehabbed him really hard, got him back to the field around a month after the first one. He played about a month, and then he dislocated again. Then the whole team had to meet, surgeon, me, athletic trainers, parents, him, and he ended up deciding to come back and play in the state championship eventually. So he had 2 traumatic patellar dislocations, and then eventually after the season, he had MPFL reconstruction, and then he also had right knee drilling for this articular cartilage lesion and some bone grafting, right at that lesion that had the Oates procedure done to it before. And so the case really focuses more on after the MPFL reconstruction and the way that I took him through that case, but there is some flair from the other problems that he had before that surgery as well. Most notably that patellar lesion that seemed to be the source of his pain throughout most of rehab.
Definitely. I feel like the conjugal defects are always just such a tricky case to manage, and just trying to be able to monitor and really understand, how you can try to push the envelope with the athlete in front of you, just so their preparation's high enough without actually overloading and setting things back. It's a tough balance. I feel like a lot of times people will hear MPFL reconstruction or any kind of surgery that happens within the knee, and they say, okay, post-op knee. I know my principles with ACL management or with MCL management, meniscus, whatever it is. Could you maybe take a step back and explain a little bit more as to why, what's different about an MPFL reconstruction rather than someone just saying, it's a post-op knee. I've done this a million times before.
Yeah, so what I really tried to do in this rehab was kind of like you just said. I took what I knew from other post-operative knee courses and available evidence. And then I took what the evidence says about MPFLR reconstructions, which is actually very limited, especially in the higher level athletic population. And then I considered the patellar lesion and I kind of put it all together in a case. And to be honest, like I just said, the research is limited, but I tried to take elements from all of that and put it together. And I also relied on the surgeon to kind of instruct me on the biological healing timeframes that he was kind of envisioning for the kid. So I think what was different was he really hated deeper knee flexion ranges because of the patellar lesion. So when I was testing him in the beginning and treating him in the beginning, I tried to stay out of those, but eventually work into them and test him into those ranges to make sure he was resilient. I stayed away from any ballistic sort of isokinetic testing in the beginning. We stayed pretty isometric because I wanted to make sure that that patella wasn't moving around too much with that MPFL reconstruction going on. So a little bit similar, but for a different reason than you might see in ACL. So similar in the fact that I started isometric, moved to isokinetic, but really because I was trying to give grace to where the patellar lesion was, what ranges he hated, and also just make sure I wasn't moving that kneecap around too early on in rehab.
With some of those ISOs, are you trying to like sort of provide any sort of biofeedback with the athlete, or maybe even now today? Um, where do you kind of value the isometric kind of testing versus training continuum? I feel like a lot of times we now have, resources, right? You take force frame, for example, that has training mode. You can kind of set boundaries and say, hey, I want you to stay within this. You have a report that says you did X, you did good, bad, or somewhere in between. When you're looking at isometrics as a whole, where do you kind of look at them from a testing side of things, from a training side of things? How did you sort of implement, I guess, isometrics as a whole within this case?
It's just a tool in the toolbox. It's just another piece of the rehab. It wasn't the most important thing. It wasn't the least important thing, but it was one of the safest things that I thought that I could test in a nice constrained way from the beginning. So I started testing him at 60 degrees of knee flexion, and then I would take him out of the open chain scenarios and I would put him in that similar angle in closed chain scenarios. And this was always just a sprinkling into the rehab that I was doing. It was never to be honest with you, the main driver. Again, it was just another tool in the toolbox just to see if he was resilient at this angle and how he was reacting to the training that we were doing at the time.
No, I love that. So when we're bringing up testing technologies and things like that, I think it's a fair, opportunity to dive down what some of the, like, we can break it down by stages, or we can just go, as a whole. What were some of the main KPIs that you were using to kind of track his rehab and sort of determine, a quote unquote passage between stages?
Yeah, so what I ended up doing, I looked at everything from isometric quad, hamstring, hip strength at multiple different angles, isokinetic testing 60 and 300 degrees per second towards the end of rehab. We did Nordboard, Vald. We did force frame. It's not a plug for the podcast, but that was just the tech that we had access to and that we wanted to use. Um, and to be honest, when we first started, I was just looking to see his capacity at some of the safer angles, and I used it as a tool to see if the training that I was doing was helping. He had a lot of knee inhibition. I mean, we know this happens at an ACL rehab. And so I took all the interventions that I would use with an ACL, neuromuscular stimulation, contralateral eccentric training, BFR, and I tried to apply it to him, and I wanted to see if these interventions were working. Now, what was nice about this case was I had some baseline data for him. I had some performance baseline data for him before he was injured, but I also had some pre-surgery baseline data. So after the season ended, right after, I brought him into the clinic. I did some isometric and isokinetic testing with him, and also some force plate testing, just to see where he was at, because he was still very functional at the time. He just played a state championship and won. So I was just curious to see where he was at. And so I had that, and I was curious just to see where he was in relation. And I was also curious about his contralateral leg as well. There's a great paper by Dr. Kutsafaki that shows after ACL, you got that contralateral limb that's gaining strength. And this is actually what happened to him. That might be a side effect of all the contralateral eccentric training we did from the beginning. But to be honest with you, I was interested in him having two strong limbs while it be asymmetric than rather having two weak symmetric limbs. And so that was something that was very important to me. And the baseline data helped with that. And then the consistent testing after interventions helped with that as well.
No, that's great. I know very briefly you mentioned like a quick assessment when it came to force plates and things like that. And I know there's going to be, I don't know, 100 practitioners listening to this and being like, okay, you use force plates. What tests did you do? What metrics are you looking at? Blah, blah, blah. I feel like it's a perennial hot topic for these sorts of cases. Would you mind just kind of giving us a background on, what were you looking at? And maybe a little bit of a rationale as to, why you were looking there for the knee rather than somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to preface this with I have a lot to learn about the force plates. I have a performance director here in New York that is an absolute whiz genius with the force plates, and he's taught me a lot even since I've come here. And I will say I kept it pretty simple. You can imagine some of the metrics that you're looking at can be quite overwhelming. So I was looking at impulse asymmetries, and I was looking at height. I did specifically a counter movement jump and a single leg counter movement jump. If I were to redo this again, okay, counter movement jump, absolutely. I would have added a double leg drop jump in there. And I don't know that I would have put as much stock into the single leg counter movement jump that I did. This is coming from, again, a little bit of my performance director's past work and maybe biases that I think actually are for the better, just about the inherent variability in the single leg counter movement jump without a lot of baseline data for this kid. We might be overlooking some asymmetries that we see in that, even in some of the most stable metrics like height. So I'm going through a process right now where I'm rethinking this metric. I'm trying to see how long it takes somebody to normalize and certain variations of certain metrics whenever they're doing the single leg counter movement jump for the first time. So I probably would have felt more confident if I had more than one time point of baseline data for this kid in the single leg counter movement jump, but I don't, and I didn't. So that's one of the things that I think I would have changed looking back. There's a lot of new metrics that, I'm getting into here and still have a lot to learn. So just like the listeners that are listening to me out there, I'm with you. I'm trying to read as much as I can and learn from my mentors here as much as I can to see how I can improve this practice.
Definitely. And that's I feel like that's the beautiful part about this is that there's almost not necessarily a negative connotation, but there's like a caveat when you said, it's pretty simple. It's like, well, rehab's complex enough, right? We don't need to like then go down into the coefficient of restitution as a metric that we're going to track for a long period of time, right? That's just, like those sorts of things, while it may be valuable in certain contexts and certain, practitioners may value that more so than a reactive strength index type of a metric or something like that. We don't need to dive super deep into some of these sorts of things, especially when you're still seeing large differences in the metrics that you're looking at, right? I think that was the biggest thing that I've had a takeaway from is if the metric changes when you assume it to change after you've done some sort of training, then therefore it's probably going to be a decent enough proxy for the value or the capacity that you're looking at, right? And if that's your kind of threshold, then it doesn't need to be complex. It doesn't need to be fancy. It can just be what it is. And so, no, I can definitely appreciate it. Force plates just become complicated very quickly because there's a lot of metrics that you can look at. But at the same time, there's a lot of value you can derive from them, even with the simple stuff.
Yeah, if you walked into my office right now, share an office with all the staff, my performance director, Dr. Dave Howarth, and I were having a conversation the other day. The board is just filled with maps of all these different force plate metrics, and I'm starting to get a little bit in my head. And he's like, "Calm down. We have a lot of time to go over this." And something that he's taught me that has calmed me down a little bit is some of this stuff is also relatively cohort dependent. So I'm really excited about learning about the group that we have here and understanding what metrics are normal to them. And if, God forbid, they become injured, how we can get back to those metrics or be even better than the metrics that they had before they were injured. So I'm really looking forward to that process with him and the rest of the staff here.
Most definitely. I'm gonna corral things back into the case a little bit. I feel like every practitioner knows that at some point you'll be crushing a case, and then they're gonna come in and they're gonna say, "Hey, something happened. My knee's flared up again. We have some sort of a setback." What was the specific time in which that I'm assuming happened within this case, and what did you do to manage it?
Yeah, so I mentioned the symmetry piece, particularly in some of your isolated muscle testing, and I'm talking about the quad here. So the kid was strong in comparison to his baseline data through most of rehab, even in the beginning. And he was off the charts strong compared to normative data for his age, his sport, and whatnot. But I was seeing asymmetries in the beginning, 25, 30%, 17%. And I was like, oh, the physical therapy world is telling me 10%, 10%. Like, is this bad? And I spoke to a lot of mentors during this time, and I kind of alluded to it before. I decided that I would rather have two strong asymmetric limbs than either two weak symmetrical ones or stop training the contralateral side just to get symmetry. And this is one of the things that I had to wrestle with myself, because what would happen is he'd have this unbelievable peak torque to body weight, and then he'd see the symmetry, which is what every other physical therapist that he's worked with told him about, and he'd be like, "Oh my God!" And I'm like, "Okay, we need to take a step back here. We need to put this in comparison to your baseline. Let's put a comparison to normative data and make a story out of this." And then that kind of trailed into me looking at the way that he moved and making sure that maybe those asymmetries weren't necessarily showing up in some of the other more dynamic tasks, change of direction, top speed tasks. So as long as they weren't showing up there, uh, I thought that what we were doing was okay.
It's a beautiful transition. I love it. With that, you kind of are using certain numbers as a way of, justifying some of your decision making and certain things like that. And decision making as a topic itself is just something that I find to be very fascinating. I'll steal the analogy from Scott Morrison where you can be, you can stop at a red light, which is the right decision to make, and you can still get rear-ended, right? Which is a poor outcome. Conversely, you can run that red light, not get rear-ended, and pass through, and luckily nobody hits you. still the wrong decision, but you had a positive outcome. I guess being outcome agnostic with this case, what were some of the ideas that you had in your head that you used to sort of justify saying, hey, even if this person goes back and the first day they go, they get injured, this is how I'm justifying to show that my decision for them to return back to sport is accurate and less wrong.
Yeah, so return to sport is tough. How do we know that they're absolutely truly ready? The way that I think about it is I did all these tests and constraint scenarios because I thought that these qualities were important to the things that they might need to express on the field in a more chaotic environment. So what I did from an early standpoint was when I thought that he was expressing the force needed to show certain qualities on the field, we started getting his quarterback coach and his strength and conditioning coach involved, and we started taking the constraints off of him. And we did this in a very stepwise, slow fashion over time. So it wasn't like, okay, we kept him in the clinic for 6 months, constrain. Okay, he can kick 3.0 newton meters per kilogram. Amazing. He's ready to go play football. It's not like that. And I think, in the past, when I used to think like that, I think it's silly to put so much stock in one metric or two metrics or three metrics. This is a whole athlete here we're talking about. Yes, the constraint things are maybe important to begin with, because if they can't even do that, are they going to be able to expose it on the field in a chaotic environment? I don't know. So I try to control what we can control in the constrained ways, and then slowly taking the reins off into more chaotic environments. And I relied heavily on a strength and conditioning coach and his quarterback coach to help me with that process.
Definitely. I like that thought process too. It's kind of you take assessments, right? You do knee extension, you do knee flexion, you do, whatever isometric or isokinetic or jump testing that you're doing, and you say, great, all of these look really good, right? That is your baseline. That's like that in theory, granted I have a large amount of biases myself as well, but that should be minimum standard, right? That shouldn't necessarily then say, cool, you're good to go. That should just say, okay, cool, we now know that based on jump testing from force plates, based on knee extension and hip abduction and adduction and knee flexion strengthening, maybe a little bit of calf in there too, you have enough force production capabilities in that limb to be able to express that on the field. Now let's see if you can do that in a controlled environment and slowly open the gates up from there. And I think the way you put it was great too, of just like, this doesn't necessarily mean, okay, checkbox, 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 we're done. This just says, okay, you've now earned the right to get onto the field and start practicing or whatever it is,
Yeah, you mentioned calf. That's one of the things that I put in when I did this presentation for Sportsmith. One of the things that I didn't neglect in strength, but I probably neglected more than I should have in testing. Calf plays so much of a role in jumping and just everything that we do. And so some of the asymmetries or things that I was seeing in the jumps may have been related more to the calf complex, maybe rather than the knee. I don't know. But yeah, I learned a lot from presenting this, doing this, and there are even so many things that I would change now being here in New York, like I alluded to before. It's a messier process. I made it sound so nice. Okay, constrain, they're doing well. Let's take the constraints off. Beautiful. They're gonna fly off into the sunset. They're gonna return to sport. It wasn't that easy, and it never is that easy. There's an art to it, and there's gonna be ups and downs that I'm learning with rep after rep. He had some patellar pain, and in the beginning I was a bit nervous. I talked to the surgeon, talked about the biological healing timeframes, talked about what we were doing, talked to other mentors, calm me down a little bit. Okay, let's move forward. It's never gonna be a straight line. There's gonna be quite a few ups and downs, but that's also why I tested the way that I did, to make sure that through those up and downs, I thought that we were moving in the right direction. And it also helped him understand where he was in the process as well.
Definitely. I feel like that's such an underrated part of testing, is just on the athlete side too, of just being able to say, hey, just so and I've chatted with some people that I used to work with clinically that ironically now work at Vault as well. And we've chatted before, and they've just sort of said, like, it's actually a pretty good proxy of, like, if they're at around 80% symmetry and you don't show it to them and say, hey, give me a number on like how close you feel like you are to return, normally they'll say anywhere between 70 and 90, you know, and like it's a funny thing where like there is some sort of internal feedback that's going on within their own proxy, and then you show them, hey, it's 80, great, okay, we're on target with what your expectations are and with what the numbers are showing, and that just, I feel like, further solidifies buy-in for the athletes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just plug one more thing that I thought that just kind of came to mind that I think might be important. There's a lot of really good work going on with some of the force steadiness stuff, Dave Sherman, and I think that's important stuff that's coming out. And so I'm starting to pay attention to more than just the numbers on these tests as well. And we're talking about constrained scenarios.
Same thing with counter movement jump or drop jump or squat jump data, right? You see the numbers, right? But you can also then, once you look at the actual shapes that they're creating on the force plates or even on an isometric trace too, like the force steadiness like you're talking about. But no, that's amazing. Hannah, one thing to just sort of wrap up, when you look at this case now and how you're practicing today, you've kind of alluded to a couple different examples throughout this, but what like truly practical takeaways do you consistently kind of come back to and use this case as like one of those things in the back of your head the next time you see whether it's truly just a post-op knee or whether it's just any other injury? What are some of the takeaways you had from this case that you can now apply to your day-to-day practice?
Yeah, I think it solidified the consistent testing for me. I think it really did help inform my practice throughout the course. And the environment that I'm in now, I think I might have to be a little bit more graceful when deciding when to test and why to test. If you're talking about some of the more acute cases here, and you want to be sure that they're good in the constrained scenario, and you want to do a NordBoard test to make sure their hamstring's good before they go out to practice because you've been taught that they should do it before they do anything else because it's so important. Well, the practice here is much more important than that constrained test. So I have to be a little bit more tactful maybe on deciding when to test and why to test. In the past, I had a lot of the time and resources and the ability to just make those decisions because it was the high school athlete coming into the clinic. It was the college athlete. Now at the professional level, it's just a little bit different. So I had to be a little bit more mindful, I think, of the time that I test, even though I still think it's important to collect data over time.
100%. No, it's a great thing to kind of wrap up with. Hannah, first of all, thank you so much for sharing this case, sharing some of the insights, and sharing your knowledge with the listeners. I think this is it's a refreshing type of a podcast, in my opinion. So I think the listeners will really enjoy it. If they have follow-up questions or if there's other opportunities that they're curious about and want to reach out to you, how can people best get connected to you?
Yeah, I should know my Instagram handle. If they want to reach out to me, I'm on Instagram all the time. Hannah Marchant 9, just the way that it's spelled on the podcast here. Just add the 9 at the end. Reach out to me there. I apologize if I'm a little bit delayed on some things. The season's really getting into the thick of it now, but I will do my best to respond when I can because I really value talking to everybody out there. I'm really thankful for the mentors that answered me when I was trying to look for some questions when I was coming up. So yeah, reach out for sure.
Awesome. Anna, thank you so much. Really looking forward to seeing how the growth trajectory continues to go up and up on your career, and it'll be awesome just to see where you end up.
Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate the chat.